This is the LatinNews Podcast. I am your host, Richard McColl, here in Bogota, Colombia. And this week's episode, we're going to be addressing the issues in Argentina. Of course, incredibly interesting what is going on. A lot of news out there, specifically about the government of President Milei and the economy that he is overseeing. And so this week, we are very honored to have Jorge Morgenstern on the podcast. He's the chief economist at Galicia Más, previously chief economist for South America for HSBC, hugely experienced in this field for the region. It is a great pleasure to have you here, Jorge.
Thank you, Richard, for having me. Thanks a lot.
You're there in Buenos Aires right now. I'm here in Bogota, two very different cities, two very different societies. And well, we are all eyes are on the economy of President Milei's government there in Buenos Aires. And I think, well, certainly President Milei is a character that captures the imagination and indeed, does dominate some headlines when you think of, Argentina being an economic, I don't want to say, it was a warning for much of the region when we take a look at Argentina's contemporary economy. But in terms of Milei and how he sees his achievements, and then, of course, I'd love you to put this all into context. He has overseen a reduction in inflation. His government appears to have a fiscal surplus. There's been the dismissal of 35,000 public sector employees, the closure of ministries, and a reduction in Argentina's credit debt. So perhaps we could just jump in, Jorge, and say, can we say that up till now, President Milei has been doing a good job?
I would say that in his own terms, but also in the terms of the opposition, it's difficult to argue with that. I think that even, again, the opposition may recognize that he's doing a better job than what they thought, that he's stronger than what they thought he was going to be. So for critics, it's also a tricky situation. Just to give you an image, we are recording this the day after Donald Trump's inauguration. And thinking that yesterday we saw the image of the rotunda at the Capitol with Javier Milei inside, just two rows behind all the former presidents of the United States. He was there with Giorgia Meloni and other foreign dignitaries. That was really unexpected. That was something that I don't know. Even at the beginning of the Milei administration, it would be hard to believe that was going to happen. Even more so during the 2023 electoral campaign. That was something that, it's still difficult to digest and understand what will it mean for Argentina. But again, domestically, yes, he's doing a job in his own terms that's very good. And I think that, again, even for the critics, so far, better than what they have been saying.
Mm-hmm. So, he came in with this idea of, the shock therapy, and that's what he's done. But how can we point to him being able to consolidate stability, let's say, in 2025, in a year when he's got midterm elections?
Yeah, the shock therapy was almost like a tactical strategic decision. It was in opposition to what the Macri administration had done, which was a very gradual attempt to reduce the fiscal deficit and in general to tackle the problems that they saw with the government. In the case of Milei, they understood from the beginning that they did not have access to markets, that they were not going to have access to markets. There was no way to fund a gradual transition. But also they understood that probably the Argentine society was better, or the situation was better handled with doing first and asking for permission later. Better asking for being sorry instead of asking for permission. And that's what they've done. It's you first do all the significant adjustment, at least what's within your realm of possibilities. And if that has positive results, the people will be behind you. But if you start to negotiate your way out of a difficult situation, probably you're not going to get there. That was the underlying assumption. And indeed, that was what they did. And they were successful in doing so.
As you mentioned, able to, as you say, it was, we would say in English, he's taking no prisoners.
Yeah.
He's doing what he set out to do, but not negotiating.
Not negotiating. And you mentioned the midterm elections that are coming in 2025. Not negotiating, is that a good strategy for the elections? It certainly was a relatively okay strategy for the first year. Maybe not negotiating has precluded him from having some victories. He has asked for Congress to approve 2 nominations for the Supreme Court and has unable to pass those, for example. But not negotiating has implied that he is submitting the opposition, with a stronghold of financial resources instead of sharing those. And when people see that at least at the federal level, things are starting to improve, they might think that that's the right way to do and start to pressure their own local governments. We have a very federal structure of government in Argentina, and that's in part what the 2025 midterm elections were going to be about, whether the national strategy of dealing with government translates to the local governments as well.
Do you think he'll be able to strengthen his support in Congress? Because, of course, he needs that support.
Yeah, that's almost a given because he has so very low support. To give you an example, is like having a third-party candidate in the U.S. coming to government. He did not even have the number of legislators in order to block a potential impeachment. He barely escaped other initiatives of Congress to override vetoes. They required 2/3 of Congress, and he barely got the 1/3 needed to block it. It's for sure he's going to improve his position in Congress. The question is whether he's going to be close to having a majority, and the answer is no, very difficult. It's almost impossible. The other question is whether his strengthening his position will be at the expense of what could be potential allies, the former Juntos por el Cambio, the coalition that ruled the country in 2016 to 2019, or at the expense of the opposition that we can call the Kirchnerists of the Peronists. And it's probably going to be more at the expense of the former. It's going to be more a question of having a small bloc that is closer to his ideas than to widen the, let's say, pro-market or market-friendly presence in Congress. That's what 2025 and the midterm elections, etc., is about.
It's a very interesting situation coming from such as, as you'd say, like an outsider, this disruptor image, and then now having to obviously formalize himself in that way. You won't get a majority, but I did see statements of him calling for support. Imagine, look what we've done so far. Imagine what we can do with the wind behind us. He'll still push through. He'll still go through, even without a majority. It seems very clear to me that he'll continue to push through without negotiating. Do you feel that's the same?
Yeah, that's probably going to be the case. And on that, the economy is the big asset that he has at the moment, and many questions will go back to the economic performance. I think that, going back to the beginning of the questions about what has happened, it's clear that he got to government at a point in which the Argentine society was suffering with a level of inflation that they could not tolerate. So they were able to accept sacrifices in order to reduce that pain. Remember that Argentina had not only two-digit annual inflation rates since 2007, but in particular inflation above 100% per year over the past 5 years. So in average, I mean. So when he got to government with inflation running at 7, then 10, then 12, and in the last month of the Kirchner administration, 25% per month, I think that you cannot, you have to agree with him that Argentina was on the verge of an hyperinflation. There was some hyperinflation sense in the air. And when you get there, people will be able to tolerate maybe some policies that otherwise they would not. And if you are victorious on that, they might give you leeway to do many things that otherwise they wouldn't. And unfortunately, Argentina can give you an example on that, and this is something that will be referred a lot in Argentina in the near term, in the near future, is after defeating hyperinflation and very high inflation in the early 90s, President Menem was able to be re-elected, to reform the constitution in order to be re-elected, even at a time where unemployment was rising to 2-digit percent. And with the economy showing some strains already. So if we can extrapolate that to 2025 and think that maybe the population will be able to tolerate things from Milei, thanks to him beating what could have been an hyper moment, probably more than what you would have expected.
And the word you use, tolerating, is an interesting term because, of course, we look at the figures in Argentina at the beginning of 2024, poverty exceeded 50%, but by the third quarter, it's down to 38.9%. I mean, can we say this is going to continue to drop, or are these, severe measures of austerity going to create further issues?
Well, first of all, the poverty figures in Argentina, those are a tricky story that if you go, I mean, you can go into a very long discussion whether those are a good measurement or not. The poverty line used in Argentina is a very strict one. You can say that maybe with the same standard used in other countries, poverty might be around the half of those numbers. But also the problem is that poverty related to income, whether your income is above certain amount of pesos that you need to buy certain stuff, in moments of such significant swings in inflation, poverty goes up and down, like you said, 15 percentage points from one quarter to the other, and certainly that's not how people feel. Using that measure, yes, poverty will keep going down because inflation has gone down and real wages are recovering after a significant drop in the first part of 2024. So yes, for sure, poverty will go down from those levels. But going more to on what Main Street will feel, the question is about the recovery of economic activity. Yeah. One thing that we know that's happening is that economic activity overall is recovering. It dropped significantly the first half of 2024. Bear in mind that 2024 was a year in which the harvest was much better than the drought-ridden one of 2023. So overall, the economy fell between 2.5 and 3% in 2024, but with a significant contribution of the agricultural sector because of the harvest. So the rest of the economy was probably falling around 5%, and much of that decline happened in the first half of the year.
Yeah.
So the second half of the year has been one of first quite rapid and then more steady recovery. There's this figure that we call the carryover effect to 2025. If the economy doesn't grow at all during 2025, in average, you'll see GDP expanding 2% comparing to 2024. But the question, and we are getting closer to an issue that, of course, we have to discuss in Argentina at this point. The question is whether the exchange rate, the competitiveness of the economy will allow, let's say, a shockful recovery or not. There's a risk that you can go into what you can call a jobless recovery. Argentina has a number of opportunities or realities more than opportunities, particularly in the energy sector, that assure you that you're going to have growth in 2025, and you're going to have a strong platform for growth beyond. The energy sector is booming thanks to unconventional resources that are being exploited. The infrastructure for that was put in place years ago. Part of that with the previous government that is expanding now. Of course, there's some investment to be done still, but that is something that will provide a base. The question is whether you can get the mainstream, and particularly the urban areas, to feel that progress.
Sure.
There are, besides the energy sector, there's a policy that the government passed through Congress that is basically a tax stability regime called RIGI, that gives you an idea, like puts all companies with large investment on a tax scheme that gives you an idea what they are aspiring for the private sector to have in the future. No need to surrender your dollars, no limits to dividend payments, no limits to access to the FX market, and corporate tax rate at 25%. There are significant investment coming within that regime, particularly in the mining sector as well as the energy sector. The mining sector is another one that is due to expand, maybe lagging a little bit the energy sector, maybe with production coming in 2026 and 27. But again, this is a primary sector. The other big sector that you can see booming in Argentina are the agricultural sector, that even with the exchange rate is on the verge of not being competitiveness. They have a very large specific taxation that maybe the government can begin easing this year. But again, although this is a sector that has a significant spillover in many cities in the country, this is not a sector that drives employment in the large urban areas. So the key question, and this goes back to the electoral discussion, is whether this recovery will be felt in the outskirts of the city of Buenos Aires, the outskirts of the city of Rosario, for example, to give you the two largest urban areas, and whether it will be enough for people to vote, or they will be convinced by the opposition that this is not a good regime.
So there are a number of things there. You talked about the improvement, obviously, in the harvest after the drought. I know we're early into 2025, but how are things looking environmentally for Argentina? Are there any predictions?
Yes, they're not looking that good. I mean, the different exchanges in Argentina that we look at, that usually they go faster in their predictions than the USDA. They are warning that we may have a not very good harvest in 2025. I think things are up for grabs. To give you an idea, during the last year, we had 55 million tons of soybean production. This year is looking like 53 according to the exchanges. But they are saying, look, this is likely to be revised downwards. It depends on what happens in the next few weeks. So, we are looking outside, looking at the weather. I told you of the record that this was not a very hot summer. That's indeed the case, but also it became a bit of a hotter one in January, and it rained this weekend. And there's a point in which you can argue that Argentina is a G20 country, but in January and February, economists just put their hand outside and see how much it is raining. That's basically the way we make projections. It has not rained enough. Probably we're going to have a problem there. And still in the first half of 2025, the agricultural sector is expected to be the main provider of dollars for the country. That's probably the more scarce commodity in Argentina. And that's one of several risks that we see for this year. Again, there could be a much better expectation for future years, particularly if the government is able to cut taxes on the agricultural sector. But for this year in particular, things are not that great yet.
Okay, so we will be looking at the weather forecasts and, of course, predictions for harvests in Argentina, because it seems to me that it's incredibly connected there. But we've skirted around it, but you've mentioned it, of course, the issue of US dollars and foreign currency, and of course, I think we should probably bring up the IMF right now, which is has been, I would say, is cautiously optimistic or moderately optimistic with the recent meetings with Milei, but they will continue to call for Argentina to lift currency controls, update utility tariffs, and improve fiscal adjustments. It seems to be what is going to happen. It seems to be something that will play out almost naturally under Milei. Do you think so?
Yes. I mean, going back to your points in reverse order, utility tariffs, they are a much better reflection of cost now, around 80% of cost recovery compared to 50% at the beginning of 2024. And to some extent, that also relates to what I mentioned about energy. Energy costs are falling because of increased production. So the effort in terms of increasing the tariffs in order to reduce the subsidies is not as significant as it was. You just have to keep, more or less them stable in real terms. The fiscal adjustment, I think that is something that can be maintained. The fiscal equilibrium that the Milei government achieved, that is something that can be maintained in 2025, but something that I mentioned at the beginning, maybe the big challenge is whether you are able to transmit part of this adjustment to provinces. Provinces have equilibrium, but they also have a significant tax pressure. Half of the taxes collected in Argentina are collected by provinces or are transferred automatically from the national government to provinces. They are in charge of around half of the public spending bill. So without them, it's very difficult to engage in any significant reduction of the tax pressure in the country. And going to the FX situation, flexibilizing the controls, yes, that's something that the government has been doing, and we expect them to continue to do. Where I think is a bit of a more trickier point, particularly regarding the IMF and the government, and also us economists, like a third party observing, is what type of regime are we going to go to? And the government has been particularly cagey about that. It's like, I know that, a professional problem that we have as economists in Argentina is that this government is not telling us what they're going to do in many aspects. And we have to start to accept that. They're not going, they say, we might tell you what, but not when. We might tell you our goal, but not how. And this is a bit difficult to live with. We don't have a very, public central bank discussing monetary movements in length or doing press conference every month, for example. What's going to happen with the exchange rate in the coming months? We know now. The government has told us the exchange rate now moving at 2% per month is going to start moving at 1% per month beginning February. Okay. But what we don't know, and they are not telling us, and at least not publicly to the IMF, is what type of regime are we going to have once that crawling peg is over? Whether that will be a fixed exchange regime, well, you need FX reserves in order for, if necessary, sell dollars, but mostly for people to know that you have FX reserves in order to defend a parity of the currency. And Argentina does not have FX reserves. There are talks that maybe they can get some from the IMF, but probably I think it will be difficult for the IMF to lend money to Argentina to defend a parity on the currency that is out of equilibrium, and they think the current one is probably out of equilibrium. Whether Argentina is going to have a floating FX regime, Milei said so a couple of times, and we take very close note of what he said. He said, well, we don't have reserves, but we are not going to need reserves because we're going to go to a fully floating FX regime. But people are going to have no pesos, so they're not going to be able to buy dollars, and we're going to have no problem. I think that's a very, very risky move, particularly, before elections, before the October 2025 elections. Remember that the elections, the true elections at the end of October, because any volatility can translate into a political defeat and then a regime defeat. This is really the test of the October elections is very, very relevant. If they pass that test, maybe they can do many things with the FX regime. Some advisors to the government have said that Argentina cannot have a floating FX regime. Probably will have to have one with a strong intervention, more similar to Peru. Some economists, we maybe agree with that. The IMF at some point said that Argentina was going to have a regime in terms of dual currency regime like the ones of Uruguay and Peru, but the government strongly denied that, because remember that back then at the beginning there was a promise of dollarization. So we still don't know that part. There's constantly an ongoing debate whether the current exchange rate in Argentina is too expensive or not. You can argue that, yes, Argentina is an expensive country now for tourists that were flocking in 2022, and suddenly they see that the prices are more expensive than in London. You can argue that the exchange rate, if you look at the central bank buying reserves and the current account position for 2025, maybe is not bad. But again, because there are these developments in primary sectors coming that will make Argentina a country that probably is okay with a strong exchange rate. But that's a macro level issue. On the micro level, many companies have become accustomed to a closed economy with a lot of barriers. You are dropping those barriers, you are making the exchange rate more expensive, and you might see a problem of, again, how much this growth translates to jobs in the urban areas and how that impacts in elections. Unfortunately, the one thing that I cannot say is what's going to happen with the exchange rate once the government moves towards the next step after the one they already announced. It's very clear that we are going to have that 1% roll. Not very clear what's going to happen afterwards. It's very clear also on monetary issues that we have a regime in which they have a cap on money supply. That is the phase 2, quote unquote, that they announced in July. We don't know what's the phase 3 going to look like. And we are not that far from reaching the limit in terms of money supply, the amount of pesos being demanded by the public being the same as the pesos that they think is okay for the economy, like to demand after the shock of almost hyperinflation. But this is something, going back to the beginning, that we economists are starting to have to live with, and it's sometimes uncomfortable. We understand they don't want to tell us what's the next steps. the IMF sometimes is the one that can pressure them into telling them, like, what are your career plans? Like if you were your like our mother asking us for what are our plans. But it's something that we have to see. Just to finish on the IMF, we had a document published by the IMF in early January that was the closing of what was the plan, the program reached, agreed upon under the Alberto Fernandez administration in 2022. That program ended at the end of 2024. There are negotiations ongoing for a new program, but those things might take some time. I think that any significant news in the first quarter will be really surprising. It's most likely to have news on that later this year. Argentina, in the meantime, does not have to pay a lot to the IMF, only interest payments. The true payments begin in 2026. The question is, again, how you interact that with the elections. And maybe one thing that we can discuss also next is with the markets. Argentina has not tapped markets yet. It has been paying down amortization, but that will become very difficult starting from the second half of 2025. Whether investors would like IMF to agree with Argentina first, that's probably the case before you see lower yields and possibility of rolling over that.
So do you think we'll see a short-term agreement likely with the IMF rather than the longer-term negotiated?
I mean, that's a possibility. It's this document from the IMF is quite interesting because they recognize that in doing an agreement that was a 3-year agreement with a lot of very nice targets, but having all those targets set towards the last year of the agreement, they lacked any leverage on Argentina. I think that they will like to avoid that. They obviously have a government that is convinced on the, more or less speaks the same language. What Argentina still doesn't have is an opposition that also agrees with that. A short-term agreement, something that is more of a breach, can be discussed. My feeling has always been that it's very difficult for the IMF to give extra money to Argentina. This is an issue for debate. Some think that, particularly with the change in the U.S. administration, it is possible that the IMF gives extra support to Argentina. But one possibility is a more or less short-term deal, and Argentina trying to tap markets at some point during 2025, for which particularly you had to see that the elections are apparently favoring the administration. Obviously, markets like what this administration has done. So any poll that suggests that they will do well, they will perform strongly at the elections, will be well received by markets.
Well, I mean, it's positive, certainly. I mean, the challenges ahead, of course, they're very clear. They're very clear for us, to continue the disinflation, to lower poverty, improve the economy, and avoid any issues with the exchange rate. And it seems, yourself included, economists seems to agree that inflation will continue to decline, and the forecast might be 28% decline, and then the official expectation is 18.3. We do wonder about purchasing power, of course, that's come into this conversation, but I know something we should probably discuss, as you've suggested as well, is Argentina's model something that you think could be exported and imitated around the region? We have elections coming up in the next couple of years.
Yes, I mean, there were talks of a big wave around the start of the pandemic, and then going back. Basically, Latin Americans, for the most part, have been voting out their governments, exception being from Mexico, for example. The question is whether we have a new round of elections in 2025 and 2026. Let's put it this way: Chile, Colombia, and Peru are going to have new governments at some point in 2026. Mm-hmm. Some will vote in this year, some next year. Argentina, so you mentioned this at the beginning, was usually a warning. Usually what you don't want to look like, at least in economic terms. What will happen if they see Argentines, particularly now, thanks to the strong exchange rate, flocking the beaches in Colombia and buying from shopping malls in Santiago, whether we're going to say, I want to be like them or not. That's one part of the discussion. The other part of the discussion, really, that I think elections around Latin America are about, is not just economics, it's also the crime situation, the feeling that, there's more of gangs going around the region. That type of crime is also an issue of debate. And probably one that, might make an impulse for a change in government in these three countries that are the one having elections next. The Milei government, of course, also comes with this idea of a strong hand against crime. And indeed, some of the figures in principle suggest that in some of the hottest areas of the country, the city of Rosario, crime has gone down. So will that be an image that can be portrayed as the one that Peru, Colombia, or Chile have to follow? It could be the case. We were discussing the recent announcement of the team of advisors by Vicky Davila in Colombia, and they are full of Milei acolytes, for example. What does it mean for Chile? Is the center right going to take that motto? Is the more far right be the one taking it? That's difficult to say. And in Peru, of course, it's difficult to say. But it can also be the case that if you ask me, what's the next Peruvian president? Who's the next Peruvian president? I can say that could be somebody that we don't expect. That would be the right answer, probably. And within that answer, maybe somebody that comes from, with this sort of need for big reforms and need for tackling the government, corruption, etc., and crime. That might be a message that that reaches people in a way that maybe it didn't a few years back. So let's see what happens. But of course, in principle, so far, the Milei experiment, looking from outside, is relatively positive. Of course, there's a lot of hardship, some of which was almost unavoidable because of the starting point. There is some procedures that you might want to do somewhat differently on how to adjust the public sector, maybe not so much of a chainsaw, maybe more of another tool. But it can be a very contagious message.
As you said, we said at the very beginning, it's such a visual image. Obviously, the chainsaw. I think in Colombia it would be a machete, but it would be a fascinating evolution to watch. The Milei experiment spreading across the region, a model to be exported. Certainly, one of Argentina's unfortunate reputations could then be sort of pushed to one side. But I would say then, overall, as we bring this to a close, Jorge, your outlook is positive. I mean, there are caveats, but your outlook is positive.
My outlook is positive. Yes. I think that, again, I have to recognize that some of the things that the government will do, I don't know, because they are not telling us, and I hope they have the message, and I hope they know how to tackle the situations that are going to come. My reservations are on some of the methods, yes, but also knowing that, maybe as I said at the beginning, the strategy require the methods not to be nice ones. They had to be mean in order to do something. That was a part of the idea. Another big question is whether the world is gonna help Argentina or not, or if it's not gonna help Argentina, will that be too much? We mentioned the weather, of course, the strengthening of the currency, and particularly what happens in Brazil, how does Brazil perform, whether the currency of Brazil depreciates in particular, that's a problem. US dollar strength in general is usually negative for commodity prices. That's another risk. A potential, a change in geopolitical landscape and the potential for risk of aversion against EM currencies or EM bonds like the ones that Argentina will need to issue at some point. Those are things that are still risky, and so far the regime is a bit rigid, particularly on the exchange rate, but things look as if they could be positive. And again, the midterm elections will be a big test on whether Argentinians want to keep things more or less in this realm, maybe at some point changing, but still relatively market friendly, or they think that no, we better change track again and swing the pendulum back to the other side.
Well, we will see. Well, all eyes will be on Argentina, of course, for October's midterm elections, which seem to be absolutely, as always, pivotal. Let me take this moment to say thank you so much to Jorge Morgenstern in Buenos Aires. He's the chief economist at Galicia Más, previously chief economist for South America at HSBC, hugely experienced in the field. It has been a fantastic conversation, getting deeper insights into what may be happening and what could potentially happen in Argentina in the coming years, months and years. So thank you so much for your time and for coming on the LatinNews Podcast.
Thank you, Richard. Thanks a lot for having me. And well, let's see if we can keep watching Argentina developments and catch up later.
Oh, definitely. I think in a few months' time we can revisit this conversation and check where we got things wrong and where we were right, and hopefully it's all positive though in the end. So I've been Richard McColl, your host here in Bogota, Colombia. This has been the LatinNews Podcast. Thank you for listening. Remember that we release a new episode every fortnight dealing with issues from the region. Subscribe, tune in, and share. Goodbye.